Hello everyone! We're starting off tonight with a story that's both heartwarming and thought-provoking. The lengthy and frequently disregarded history of individuals born with Down syndrome. From prehistoric cultures where their existence was misinterpreted to more recent decades of stigma, advancement, and activism. This journey shows how far we've gone and how much more work remains to guarantee that every life is valued and full of potential. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Human eyes existed long before textbooks, medical facilities, or genetic science. Seeing, pondering, and using myth, feeling, and intuition to interpret the universe. When a child with a different appearance or behavior arrived in the distant past, it sparked intense, frequently spiritual reactions. There are no historical written records that describe what is today known as Down syndrome. However, archaeology offers us unique, poignant insights. A group of French academics discovered a 150-100-year-old graveyard in 2014. A small child with unique skull characteristics that matched those of Down syndrome found among the remains. Despite their disagreements, this kid was buried with dignity, not abandoned or thrown away, but tenderly laid to rest in the same revered fashion as other members of the community. It's a minor element that has a big impact. It implies that some people reacted with acceptance rather than dread long before medical terminology was created. This child would have been viewed as a quieter spirit in a world without diagnoses. Perhaps they were spoken to more gently and carried more frequently. Perhaps it was because of their peculiarities, rather than despite them, that they were liked. Intellectual and physical disparities were frequently viewed via a spiritual prism in other ancient societies. Some were held in high regard because of their unique relationship to God. Unfortunately, others were misinterpreted, feared, or avoided. In the absence of a conceptual framework for comprehending conditions such as Down syndrome, the response was heavily influenced by the culture, the era, and the disposition of those in the immediate vicinity. Something subtly fundamental is shown by the fact that we have discovered other ancient burials similar to this one, including potential cases in ancient Rome and the Andes. The human race has always included people with Down syndrome. Always. Their existence is not a recent development. It is not a defect that needs to be fixed or an issue that needs to be resolved. It is a component of life's inherent diversity. A theme that has been present throughout the history of humanity. These historic graves speak to us over the ages. I was here, I mattered, I wasn't forgotten, they say. And as we delve farther into history, we'll see how that murmur was occasionally muffled and then gradually regained its voice. We encounter civilizations full of myth, philosophy, and symbolism as we travel across the classical world, which includes ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, and more. Difference was not always viewed medically in these communities. Rather, it was frequently comprehended through mystery, faith, and metaphor. Symbolic positions were frequently assigned to people who behaved or appeared differently. Some were regarded as cosmic messengers, omens, vehicles of divine will, or being touched by the gods. Others, perceived as indications of imbalance, impurity, or inherited guilt, were regarded with distrust. Either way, people with physical or cognitive disabilities were rarely simply people. They served as emblems. This was a prescient world before genetics. Therefore, rather than leading to diagnoses, a child with Down syndrome, delicate facial characteristics, delayed speech development, or a milder demeanor may inspire stories. According to certain civilizations, these kids were fortunate and more in tune with the spirit realm. Others were afraid they were a sign of bad luck or divine retribution. Myths about children born under odd stars or touched by heavenly forces were common in Egyptian and Greco-Roman cultures. Although these texts don't specifically mention Down syndrome, they do represent a worldview in which difference was seen as fate or prophecy. That occasionally resulted in exile and other times in adoration. It's crucial to keep in mind that there was no one correct way to react. At certain villages, a kid who has obvious differences may be nurtured at the center of the household under tender supervision. In others, they may be abandoned, hidden, or left out. The worldview of the culture and the hearts of those in the vicinity determined everything. Children born with particular traits, for instance, were viewed in some ancient Hindu texts as representations of karmic cycles, lives reincarnating in different forms to impart knowledge, provide healing, or be healed. This provided a framework that recognized the spiritual worth in every individual, even though it didn't always translate into inclusive care. However, the reality is that in the absence of medical knowledge, people with Down syndrome were mainly left up to social control and superstition. They were not yet seen as completely human in the contemporary sense, that is, as having rights, protection, and opportunity. They dwelt on the periphery of civilization, rarely understood, yet occasionally feared and elevated. And for generations that misconception would persist, supported by religion, covered up by folklore, and then reframed by science. Particularly for people who lived outside the bounds of what society deemed normal, the Middle Ages carried with them a veil of quiet. As Europe changed from ancient empires to feudal kingdoms between the 5th and 15th centuries, religious doctrine, social hierarchy, and a fear of the unknown all had a greater influence on how persons with intellectual disabilities were treated. In medieval Europe, children with Down syndrome were thrust into a world of rigid beliefs. Because of the Church's enormous power, departures from the norm were frequently seen through the prism of sin and punishment. A child who spoke differently from the others, developed slowly, or had unique facial traits could be interpreted as proof of heavenly disapproval or, worse, demonic control. News of such a birth may travel rapidly in rural villages. The streets would be filled with whispers. Was the mother to blame? Was there a sin in the family? Was this kid a warning, a test, or a punishment? Imagination filled the gap because there was no scientific framework to explain hereditary disorders, and fear-driven imagination frequently results in cruelty. Many of these kids were out of sight. They may be kept indoors, raised in silence at home, and seldom ever seen in public. Some were placed in convents or monasteries where the religious were entrusted with the care of the weak and ill. This provided food, shelter, safety, and a peaceful existence in some situations. For others, it meant being institutionalized and separated from loved ones. However, the Middle Ages weren't completely cold. Within these centuries, there are shards of kindness. Every soul, regardless of aptitude, was considered sacrosanct by some religious institutions. Monks have been known to call individuals with intellectual disabilities innocents, spiritually pure, and closer to God. Even though complete inclusion was still unattainable, kindness was shown in those infrequent instances. However, this was a time of silence for the majority. Families were left to face the uncertainty on their own, without activism, community support, or a vocabulary to define Down syndrome. Their lives were mostly unrecorded, and their stories were never written. They were constantly there. However, they vanished into the past, only to be remembered in graveyards, parish records, and artwork. Nevertheless, they persevered in silence during this dark era, hoping that one day the world would be able to see them properly. Not all tales of dread, rejection, or superstition are associated with the medieval era, despite the fact that it is frequently remembered for its brutality toward individuals who were different. Moments of silent kindness, deeds of kindness that went against the grain of the time and demonstrated the enduring humanity of those who experienced it, are buried among the darker chapters of history. Families in isolated villages and small towns occasionally accepted a child with Down syndrome instead of feeling ashamed. Neither science nor support networks were available to these individuals. They responded as parents rather than academics because they were farmers, artisans, mums and fathers, and love triumphed over fear for a few of them. Rare accounts of midwives, healers, and religious leaders who describe delayed or gentle youngsters who were adored by their families provide us with this information. Some religious caregivers formed bonds that went beyond social norms at monasteries, where many people with impairments were housed, either voluntarily or out of need. Such a child could be taught basic prayers by a monk or nun, receive regular meals, or just experience the sweetness of being there. People with Down syndrome were permitted to grow, albeit slowly, at their own speed in these rare instances. Even while they might not have had a regular education, they were nevertheless part of everyday routines, helping out in the gardens, taking part in church, or helping out around the house. They were valued for who they were, not for how productive they were. Art also contains signs of compassion. Occasionally, characters with Down syndrome-like features are shown in medieval paintings, usually as angels, shepherds, or lowly saints. The message remains timeless, regardless of whether the painters were consciously depicting people with the illness or were merely motivated by people they knew. Sometimes they even contributed to the beauty of the human story. We cannot romanticize this period, of course. These deeds of generosity were exceptions to a stricter rule rather than the norm. The majority of people with Down syndrome continued to be excluded, ridiculed, or invisible. However, the exclusions are important. They serve as a reminder that there were always some who were open to seeing things differently, even during the most inflexible and terrifying periods. Those who see past status and superstition, those who made the decision to be concerned. Something within of them refused to do otherwise, not because they had to. And the future started to take root in these straightforward, bold gestures of kindness. The way society perceived those with impairments started to change as Europe transitioned from the medieval era to the scientific curiosity of the 17th and 18th century. Superstition and faith gradually gave way to taxonomy and observation. It was when modern medicine first emerged. The medical gaze, a new form of attentiveness, also arrived. People with Down syndrome have been marginalized, discussed in whispers, cared for in silence, or completely disregarded for decades. However, that was altered in 1866 by a British doctor by the name of John Langdon Down. He reported a group of patients who shared specific characteristics in a study titled Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots, while he was employed at the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots in Surrey. Small stature, rounder face, almond-shaped eyes, and mild disposition. The cause was unknown to him. They had not yet found chromosomes. However, he saw a trend. Inadvertently, he provided the world with the first medical explanation of what is now known as Down syndrome. However, the biases of his era were mirrored in his words. Based on antiquated racial notions that were regrettably prevalent in Victorian science, Langdon Down equated his patients to people of Mongolian origin. He gave the illness the name Mongolism, which would sting for more than a century. It's critical to acknowledge that Langdon Down's aims were not based on cruelty, even though they are objectionable by today's standards. In actuality, he supported humane treatment more than many of his contemporaries did. Even though the system in which his patients lived was still seriously dysfunctional, he placed a strong focus on kindness, structure, and dignity. His paper marked the beginning of something both potent and troublesome. Individuals with Down syndrome were now viewed as a category that could be diagnosed. There were repercussions for this. On the one hand, it made it possible for scientists to investigate the illness, which ultimately resulted in improvements in medicine. Conversely, it reduced people to a diagnosis, an object of study, a collection of characteristics. People with Down syndrome were no longer invisible for the first time. However, they were now being seen, examined, and categorized. Their humanity? Still frequently disregarded. Nevertheless, this was a pivotal occasion. The path to comprehension has started. In the years that followed, that route would lead through some very dark places, but it also set the stage for advocacy, empowerment, and eventually discovery. The industrial world was flourishing as the 19th century transitioned into the 20th. Technology was developing, cities were growing, and systems to organize almost every facet of human existence were being constructed. These included institutions, large establishments built to house those who didn't quite fit the mold of a society that was modernizing quickly. These facilities turned into both a haven and a jail for people with Down syndrome. Doctors, pastors, or local officials informed families, particularly those in working-class communities, that their child would do better in a specialized facility. These facilities offered professional care, structure, and safety. However, the reality was frequently much more bleak. Many of these establishments lacked skilled personnel, were overcrowded, and had inadequate funding. Children with Down syndrome were paired with people who had a wide range of diseases, from severe physical disability to mental illness. There was virtually no room for improvement, much less understanding, and no personalization. Residents had limited control over their everyday life, were required to wear uniforms, and adhered to strict timetables. This system was viewed as progressive for many years. Some families actually thought they were acting morally, protecting their kids from the discrimination and hardship that the outer world may bring. However, the children themselves felt disconnected from the event. Along with being cut off from society, they were also cut off from their towns, families, and frequently their sense of self. Additionally, institutionalization made it possible for the general public to overlook the existence of individuals with Down syndrome. It went from being visible to being forgotten. Schools failed to adjust. Workplaces were inhospitable. The idea that these people were incapable of learning, developing, or fitting in continued to exist. Of course, there were exceptions. A few facilities provided true care, with staff members showing residents warmth and patience. Some kids developed lifelong friendships, even familial ties with each other, and the infrequent caretakers who recognized their worth. In a sea of systematic disregard, however, these were islands of light. The fact that so many intelligent, kind, and capable people spent their whole lives behind closed doors is perhaps the most tragic aspect of this era. The world wasn't prepared for them, not because they were dangerous. This is a sobering chapter in history. It's a setup, though, because ultimately the tide would shift, and the formerly marginalized individuals would start to emerge, not by themselves, but with the support of their families, supporters, and a voice that the world could no longer ignore. Though not always in the correct direction, science and medicine continued to advance as the 20th century went on. What ought to have been an era of increasing empathy for those with Down syndrome turned into a moment when poisonous ideas and icy beliefs robbed humanity. Eugenics was popular during this time. The eugenics movement, which began as a misguided attempt to better the human race, spread throughout the world. The fringe thinkers weren't the only ones. Under the guise of science, it was adopted by governments, medical professionals, academic institutions, and public health initiatives. Individuals with Down syndrome were viewed as a burden on society, flawed and inadequate. The reasoning was terrifying. Sterilization might be possible to avoid or eradicate some features that were deemed undesirable, selective breeding, or institutionalization. Thus, legislation permitting the forced sterilization of people with intellectual disabilities were passed in nations such as the United States, Canada, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Under state guardianship, many young women and men with Down syndrome were unintentionally or forcibly sterilized without their consent. They were not allowed to have children, have a family, or even have basic bodily autonomy. Love, connection, and choice, the very things that define our humanity, were routinely denied. However, this philosophy was never applied more brutally than in Nazi Germany. The idea of a pure race assumed terrible connotations under Adolf Hitler's rule. The so-called T4 program aimed to eradicate individuals and children with impairments, such as Down syndrome. In clinics that passed for hospitals, thousands of them were abducted from their families and killed. Others were poisoned by gas or fatal injection, while others were starved. Under the guise of heart failure or pneumonia, their deaths were concealed by bureaucracy. Their existence was deemed unworthy of life. Their names were obliterated. These actions weren't considered war crimes. They were implemented in the name of progress and were policies. We must never forget this period of history. It serves as a harsh reminder of how readily science may be turned into a weapon when it is separated from morality and empathy. However, even during those most difficult times, there were parents, nurses, and silent opponents who stood up for these lives because they valued them and spoke the truth that the rest of the world would not listen to. They are the ones that sowed the seeds for the subsequent resistance. Beneath the language of power and purity, the T4 program, a state-sponsored euthanasia program that targeted children and people with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome, was one of the most terrible chapters in the history of disability. It took place in the heart of Nazi Germany. Quietly, it started. Families in Germany received letters requesting that they take their impaired children to specialized clinics for improved care, education, and treatment. Desperate and hopeful, parents thought they were doing the right thing. However, the youngsters were never seen again once they arrived. The T4 program's objective was frighteningly obvious, and it was called after the address of its offices, Tiergartenstraße 4 in Berlin. Take away life that are considered unworthy. Mass killings of disabled people were carried out by doctors, nurses, and bureaucrats working together. This was not a covert operation. Official stamps, written approvals, and medical paperwork were used, methodical, effective, and clean. Among the initial victims were children with Down syndrome. They were frequently the most vulnerable, the youngest, and the most obviously different. Within a few days of their arrival, some were killed, others were euthanized after being observed and examined like specimens. Falsified death certificates were issued to their relatives. Death causes are deliberately changed to allay suspicions. The deed itself was horrible, but so was the lie. More than 70,000 people had been killed by the time the T4 program was officially shut down in 1941 due to public uproar. However, the slaughter continued. It persisted for the rest of the conflict in smaller, less obvious versions. The conventional definition of war was not applicable here. They weren't troops. They had no political rivalry. They were infants in crates, cheerful teenagers, and people who cherished storytelling, music, and color. They were individuals with Down syndrome whose lives were considered too difficult, too expensive, or too dissimilar to be safeguarded. There is a lasting legacy of T4. It demonstrated to the world how dangerous it is for society to lose sight of the worth of every human life. It was more than just a Nazi offense. The crime was human, one made possible by stigma, silence, and the idea that some lives are more important than others. However, something started to move out of that shadow and waking. The world, appalled by what had transpired, started to ponder inclusiveness, ethics, and what care meant. The healing process would take a long time, but the time for reckoning had come. Something started to shift after World War II as the world came to terms with the unspeakable atrocities of the Holocaust. Quietly, slowly, but definitely. The consequences of devaluing, dehumanizing, and discarding entire groups of people were starkly and brutally witnessed by the world community. Additionally, Although this reckoning first centered on issues of race and religion, it quickly expanded to include individuals with disabilities, such as those who have Down syndrome. A movement was sparked by the T4 program's moral shock. After being forced to institutionalize their children or remain silent, parents who had previously been urged to give up their children started to speak up. They could no longer afford to give their kids a life of shame and captivity. They started organizing, initially in local groups and subsequently in national organizations. Advocacy groups like the National Association for Retarded Children, ARC, were founded in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, providing families with a forum to demand rights and dignity. These early supporters weren't famous people or politicians. Fathers and mums they were. They were devoted parents who didn't think a diagnosis like Down syndrome meant a life devoid of meaning or significance. In addition to demanding access to public education, which was then denied to the majority of children with intellectual disabilities, they started to question outmoded laws and advocate for improved medical care. The civil rights movement gave it impetus. Disability advocates started to link their struggle to the larger fight for justice as marginalized communities throughout America battled for equality. The belief that all people should be treated equally under the law, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or ability, became a rallying cry. Similar movements appeared on the other side of the Atlantic. Parents started lobbying governments and creating support networks in the UK, Scandinavia, and Australia. Advocates began organizing conferences, publishing newsletters, and developing training courses for caregivers and educators. In addition to parents, self-advocates, people with Down syndrome who started to stand up for themselves, also started to feel a sense of camaraderie. This change was enormous. It helped bring people with Down syndrome into the open and out of the shadows. Even while progress was far from flawless, a potent truth had been sown. They were able to speak, they were capable. They would also stop being silent. The advocacy era had begun. Something extraordinary occurred during the 1960s and 1970s as the advocacy movement expanded. The story's central characters, who are themselves persons with Down syndrome, started talking, not only through their families or support groups, but also through their own words, deeds, and lives. Silence started to really break during this decade. Children with intellectual disabilities can now attend public schools in several nations thanks to new laws. Every child in the US, including those with Down syndrome, has the right to a free and suitable public education, thanks to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. This was a seismic change. Previously excluded children were suddenly being admitted to classes, frequently for the first time in history. Visibility comes with education. Down syndrome children were no longer kept in hiding. Alongside their peers, they were learning, forming friendships, taking part in school plays, going to dances, and gaining self-confidence. A surprising discovery was made by educators, many of whom had never previously worked with a child who had an intellectual handicap. There was so much to be gained from these students. They had the capacity to develop, learn, and contribute, not only to the classroom, but also to the entire school community. This awareness was not limited to the classroom. People with Down syndrome started to show up in periodicals, on television, and later in movies as social conventions changed. A World Apart, a groundbreaking documentary that followed the lives of a young woman with Down syndrome, premiered in the UK in 1979. It was honest, unvarnished, and profoundly humanizing. It was the first time that many people had seen a person with the disease shown with depth and respect. Families also kept telling their stories. Memoirs, picture essays, and personal essays that captured ordinary moments of happiness, annoyance, development, and love started to spread. These tales dispelled the misconception that having Down syndrome exclusively meant suffering or hardship, but they did not minimize the difficulties. Most significantly, self-advocates started to emerge. Young adults with Down syndrome began to share their experiences, attend conferences, and give talks. Their message was straightforward but impactful. We have something to say, we are unique, and we are not less. When the world was finally compelled to look, listen, and start viewing persons with Down syndrome as human beings rather than as cases, this historical period is known as the birth of visibility. The increasing chorus of advocacy, education, and self-expression by the 1980s and 1990s started to change public perception as well as public policy. A new perspective on persons with Down syndrome was emerging, one that saw them as individuals to be included, supported, and celebrated, rather than as issues to be solved. A number of forces came together at once to cause this change. Educational reforms were expanding inclusiveness, medical discoveries were improving health outcomes, and, above all, a generation of children with Down syndrome were growing up in plain light of society after being born into a world of advocacy rather than silence. This change was mostly attributed to medical care. Better training on developmental disabilities started to be provided to pediatricians. Previously thought to be too dangerous or unattainable for kids with Down syndrome, heart procedures became increasingly common, significantly increasing survival rates. Children were able to acquire abilities that were previously thought to be unattainable, thanks to the earlier and more regular availability of therapies, including speech, occupational, and physical therapy. Life expectancy consequently started to rise. Many children with Down syndrome were not predicted to live past their teens in the 1960s. However, by the 1990s, that figure had significantly increased, with some people living well into old age and reaching into their 50s and 60s. For the first time in history, individuals with Down syndrome were growing up and leading full lives, rather than merely surviving childhood. Deeper questions had to be asked by society in light of this new reality. What would adulthood be like for them? Would they be effective? Were they able to live on their own? Could they get married? More and more of the responses were yes. Programs for supported employment started matching persons with Down syndrome with fulfilling positions in workplaces, hotels, grocery stores, and even companies founded by self-advocates. Semi-independent living was made possible through housing cooperatives and group houses, and tales of love affairs, unions, and enduring friendships between individuals who might not have had the opportunity to meet, much less see a future, a few decades prior started to surface all over the world. It was becoming evident that having Down syndrome did not define a person. They were people with personalities, aspirations, challenges, and strengths, and the world was gradually figuring out how to accommodate them. Something really lovely was taking place by the early 2000s. Once kept in the shadows in institutions or reared in silence at home, people with Down syndrome are now taking center stage, not out of sympathy or tokenism, but for the same reasons that everyone else does, to be seen, heard, and accepted for who they are. The scope of representation had expanded beyond advocacy newsletters and medical journals. Commercials, modeling campaigns, TV shows, and even stage appearances included people with Down syndrome. Through the words and experiences of those who have lived with Down syndrome, audiences worldwide were first exposed to the joyful, nuanced, and very human reality of this condition. One of the first professional models with Down syndrome was Madeline Stewart, an Australian young woman who made news throughout the world in 2009. In addition to being stunning, her images questioned the conventional notions of beauty in fashion. Madeline inspired thousands of people and changed the norms of the modeling industry by walking the catwalks in New York, Paris, and London. Pablo Pineda became Europe's first person with Down syndrome to graduate from college in Spain. In addition to his academic achievements, he went on to become a public speaker, educator, and inclusion advocate. His prominence contributed to the debunking of one of the most pervasive misconceptions about the disorder. that individuals with Down syndrome are incapable of serious thought, scholarship, or intellectual contribution. Actors with Down syndrome started portraying characters in television series, not as supporting parts but as fully realized roles. Lauren Potter, who starred in the popular television show Glee in the United States, gave a new generation of fans confidence and visibility. Her efforts helped normalize what had previously been misinterpreted, both on and off screen. However, this was about regular visibility, not simply about stardom. People with Down syndrome live in flats, work in bakeries, greet guests at hotels, and celebrate birthdays with their communities. It was about friends, neighbors, co-workers, and classmates. Because it provided a mirror and a means of seeing oneself in the world, representation was important for people with Down syndrome. Additionally, it provided the rest of society with a glimpse into their world, which is full of humor, love, ambition, and uniqueness. From obscure to visible, from misinterpreted to accepted, the world was finally paying attention, and this was the power of presence. The path to complete inclusion for individuals with Down syndrome is far from ended, despite all the advancements in activism, health, and public awareness. The world we live in today is one of paradox and joy. Simply, if many civilizations have made significant progress, others still find it difficult to accept, encourage, or simply acknowledge the worth of lives that don't conform to social norms. Prenatal screening is one of the most delicate and complicated topics. Many expectant parents worldwide now have the opportunity to determine early in their pregnancy whether their kid may have Down syndrome because to advancements in genetic testing. Furthermore, while the knowledge can empower people, it can also force them to make tough choices, particularly in societies where people with disabilities are still misunderstood or feared. Abortion rates after a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome are startlingly high in some countries, especially in areas of Europe and Asia, where they can exceed 90%. This brings up very sensitive issues. Are these decisions really free, or are they influenced by fear of the unknown, lack of support, and social pressure? Numerous parents have said that they received the diagnosis in clinically detached terms, along with a lengthy list of dangers with little reference to happiness, development, or opportunity. Few were exposed to families with children with Down syndrome who were content and successful. Even fewer spoke of the expanding group of individuals leading independent, happy lives. This quiet breeds fear. Judgment is not the problem. It's about comprehension. In actuality, many communities still lack the necessary accommodations to allow individuals with Down syndrome to fully participate in relationships, work, housing, and education. Children are nonetheless subjected to diminished expectations, restricted access, or covert exclusion, and parents are frequently left to handle these systems alone. The problem of tokenism is another. Although representation is increasing, it is occasionally viewed as a novelty rather than the standard. While many success stories remain hidden and unnoticed, a select number are widely publicized. Nevertheless, the movement persists despite these obstacles. Better policies, greater inclusion, and a societal movement toward genuine acceptance are being pushed for by advocates, including those who have Down syndrome. Because belonging, rather than awareness, is the ultimate goal. A society in which every person with Down syndrome is valued for their life and is not viewed as a mistake. One reality emerges above the cacophony when we consider the centuries-long silence, stigma, rejection, and opposition. Every life has purpose. This goes beyond a simple belief. History has repeatedly attempted to subtly demonstrate this reality, despite society's refusal to acknowledge it. The human race has always included people with Down syndrome. They have lived, laughed, struggled, survived, and taught everywhere from medieval villages to ancient burial sites, from the chilly halls of 19th century institutions to the red carpets of the 21st century. Their contributions to the world are not usually ostentatious or glitzy. It's not any less powerful, just quieter. They frequently exude kindness, integrity, and emotional intelligence in their daily lives. A remarkable kind of sincerity, a disarming warmth that can change a room, is described by many who live or work with people who have Down syndrome. They are present, genuine, and profoundly human, not because they are inspirational. We have to fight the urge to romanticize or simplify their experiences. Like everyone else, a person with Down syndrome is complicated and can experience happiness, frustration, ambition, despair, and love. Although they face difficulties in their lives, they are not constrained by them. They don't represent sorrow or purity. They are unique people with voices, histories, and free will. Additionally, their existence serves as a reminder of something essential. Perfection, productivity, or IQ are not indicators of humanity. It is determined by kindness, connection, and the ability to love and be loved. Saying that every life has purpose is not a charitable gesture. We are expressing a universal truth that is relevant to everyone, because none of us are safe if one must show one's value in order to be worthy of life. However, we can start creating a world where everyone genuinely belongs if we begin with the idea that worth is innate and that each individual matters simply because they exist. We don't need to feel sorry for people who have Down syndrome. They require our presence, our collaboration, and our readiness to pay attention, adjust, and create room. They are not historical footnotes. They represent some of the most exquisite chapters in the human story. So how have individuals with Down syndrome been handled historically? The truthful response is nuanced and multifaceted. A tale of grief and quiet, but also of fortitude, change, and love. They were marginalized for a large portion of recorded history, misinterpreted in myths, kept secret during the Middle Ages, and objectified under the chilly scrutiny of early medicine. They were dreaded at times, sometimes forgotten. Additionally, individuals were singled out for persecution just for being alive during the darkest periods, such as Nazi Germany and the eugenics movement. Nevertheless, they persevered as active participants in history rather than merely as its victims. We are here because of the teachers who supported them, the families who spoke up for them, and ultimately, their own voices. We are important. There is more to the narrative of people with Down syndrome than just their medical or social background. It's a person. It represents how our society views dignity, who we defend, who we value, and what we consider to be the worth of a life. We have witnessed a change in recent decades that was previously unthinkable. Individuals with Down syndrome completing their education, obtaining employment, appearing in movies, falling in love, fighting for their rights, and influencing their communities. The trajectory of their journey from exclusion to celebration demonstrates not only their resilience but also our shared capacity for change. However, this advancement was not made by chance. Love was the source of it. Obstinate, fierce, and enduring love. From parents who wouldn't tolerate quiet, from medical professionals who put compassion ahead of protocol, from teachers who saw potential when others saw weakness, and from individuals with Down syndrome themselves who led genuine lives in a society that frequently undervalued them. Today, that legacy of bravery, presence, and tenacity is still being written. As we come to an end of this historical trip, may we continue to learn from it, to challenge inherited bias, to elevate the voiceless, and to understand that a person's worth is always undeniable. In the human story, people with Down syndrome are not abnormalities. Its entire fabric contains these threads. Grace, perseverance, and the silent strength of being completely, unreservedly alive are all interwoven. I appreciate you listening. Consider liking the video and subscribing for more human-centered history if this tale touched you. Additionally, let me know what time it is and where you are watching from. Please let me know who is joining us this evening. Be kind, be curious, and be careful till the next time. Humans felt the need to decorate themselves long before writing was invented, before kingdoms were etched into stone, or before temples rose to the sun. One of the earliest manifestations of human identity may be jewelry in its most basic, primordial form. It started with what nature had to provide, not with money or diamonds, feathers, stones, teeth, bones, and shells. The earliest jewelry ever found was found in a Moroccan cave. 33 Nassarius shells with holes, thought to be older than 100,000 years. They were probably used as anklets or necklaces strung together as beads. Despite their seeming simplicity to our contemporary eyes, these items were innovative. They represented a breakthrough in symbolic thought, the capacity to use items worn on the body to symbolize rank, group connection, or spiritual conviction. Prehistoric societies did not make jewelry for show. It was dialogue. An animal tooth necklace could allude to a hunter's skill. A string of shells could represent kinship, trade, or fertility. Skeletons with meticulously placed decorations around the neck, wrists, and ankles have been discovered in numerous early burial sites in Europe and Africa. Evidence that jewelry was used to brand people as belonging to a sacred lineage, guide them into the afterlife, or participate in death and remembering rites. Time was spent creating decorations even in tribal and nomadic cultures when survival was the first priority. The pieces underwent shaping, polishing, and engraving. They applied pigments. These behaviors demonstrate that jewelry was not a frivolous item. It was fundamental to the human condition, a means of preserving magic, memory, and significance. The fact that this early jewelry developed independently in many parts of the world is very intriguing. Ocean and language-separated societies turned to decoration, from African ostrich shell beads to Siberian mammoth ivory bracelets. Why? Because jewelry fulfills a universal need, the desire to fit in, the urge to communicate, the necessity of changing the body from being merely made of flesh and bone to something more. Jewelry was fundamentally human even before it was adorned with regal crowns and costly metals. A quiet language of belief, beauty, identity, and safety. It was the first glimmer we had, and a whole universe of embellishment began with the first flash of a bead strung through thread. The craft of jewelry making developed alongside early human communities into major civilizations. Gold evolved from a metal to a symbol of prestige and power in Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization. Gold, silver, and valuable stones like carnelian, lapis lazuli, and agate were used by artisans in Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon to create elaborate jewelry. In temples that glistened with divine light, jewelry was used to beautify not just the living, but also the sculptures of the gods. Jewelry from Mesopotamia has significant symbolic meaning. Geometric shapes spoke of cosmic order, while spiral motifs symbolized perpetual life. In order to maintain continuity in the afterlife, women of high status frequently wore ornate headdresses, bracelets, and pendants when they were buried. These were more than just accessories, they were manifestations of governmental might, cultural refinement, and divine favor. In the meantime, jewelry found an even greater spiritual resonance in the wealthy, sun-drenched country of Egypt. The Egyptians prized gold, which was plentiful in Nubia and regarded as the incorruptible, eternal, and sacred flesh of the gods. Each item worn by a pharaoh or priestess was designed with a specific function in mind: protection, invocation, or transformation. Amulets were very significant. The scarab beetle represented rebirth and renewal. Shaped like a cross with a loop, the ankh stood for perpetual life. Wearing the eye of Horus near the forehead or heart was thought to protect against evil and promote healing. These talismans were inlaid with colorful stones, including as garnet, lapis, and turquoise, which were chosen for their spiritual and energy qualities in addition to their aesthetic appeal. Social standing was also expressed in jewelry. Inlaid rings, wide pectorals, and gold collars all conveyed tales of affluence, ancestry, and heavenly affiliation. Youngsters carried charms for protection. Collars with inscriptions were occasionally used to ornament animals. To ensure their safe transition into the afterlife, even the deceased were encased in layers of symbolic jewelry, ranging from headpieces to toe caps. Jewelry was not an afterthought in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Religion, government, and individual identity were all intertwined with it. It identified the wearer as having been selected by fate, monarchs, or gods. The foundation for what jewelry would become was laid throughout this time. A glistening manifestation of the soul, a coded language of protection, strength, and beauty that has been refined by belief and forged in fire. Jewelry developed into an art form that united civic identity with personal beauty as civilization grew around the Mediterranean. Adornments in classical Greece and Rome were statements of philosophy, taste, and even patriotism, in addition to being symbols of riches. The Greeks valued harmony in the human form as well as in sculpture and architecture. Instead of dominating the body's inherent elegance, jewelry was created to enhance it. Both gods and mortals had their heads decked with olive-branched wreaths of gold. The intricate repoussé work on bracelets and earrings frequently represented motifs from mythology. Eros, the god of desire, holding an arrow, Aphrodite emerging from the sea, or Athena with her owl. Although they gained popularity, gemstones were valued for their significance as much as their hue. Carnelian was said to soothe rage. Amethyst offered protection from drunkenness. When signing documents, engraved gems known as intaglios were pressed into wax and used as personal seals. These sculptures have authority and identity in addition to beauty. Jewelry grew much more common and lavish in Rome. Access to exotic minerals increased as the empire grew. Sri Lankan sapphires, Egyptian emeralds, and Persian Gulf pearls. Roman women, particularly those from the upper classes, wore layers of jewelry, from rings on almost every finger to intricate fibulae and brooches that kept their clothing together. Even though they were more subdued, men continued to wear amulets and signet rings, frequently engraved with family crests or protective symbols. In Rome, jewelry also transcended socio-economic boundaries. After being granted citizenship, freed slaves would wear gold rings to symbolize their newfound position. When soldiers returned from battle, they frequently carried jewelry as a gift to the gods as well as for their own use. It wasn't all vanity either. To defend themselves, many things were worn. Roman children wore a locket called a bulla, which contained amulets to protect them from evil spirits. The potency of charms was even acknowledged by rulers. Under togas, tiny representations of Hercules, snakes, and phallic symbols were worn. They were concealed yet thought to have great power. Jewelry was more than just an accessory to the Greeks and Romans. It was a biography. Every piece conveyed a tale of ancestry, morality, or faith. It revealed your identity, your values, and, occasionally, the person you prayed would keep you safe. The East, especially India, created a way where jewelry became inextricably linked to spirituality, ritual, and the rhythms of life itself, whereas the Mediterranean world shaped jewelry via aesthetics and empire. Jewelry was more than just ornamental in India. It was holy. It served as a metaphor. It was and remains a component of the language of the soul. Archaeologists have discovered exquisitely carved bangles, nose rings, and beaded necklaces made from carnelian gold and faience that date back to the Indus Valley civilization circa 2500 BCE. Indian craftspeople demonstrated exceptional talent. and an innate understanding that jewelry was not only worn but lived with even back then. In India, jewelry acted as a sort of visual scripture, narrating tales of love, fertility, protection, and divinity, in contrast to the West, where it frequently denoted riches alone. The most cherished material was and is gold. It is seen as pure, auspicious, and eternal, and it is connected to Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity. In addition to being presents, women frequently receive gold jewelry as a sign of their value, security, and spiritual armor at birth, throughout marriage, and as part of their inheritance. Every bodily portion has a sacred adornment of its own. For the forehead, Mangtika is thought to activate the sixth chakra. Toe rings that represented marital status, anklets that sung with each step, and jhumkas for the ears. Pairs of bracelets were believed to balance a woman's energies, and nose rings associated her with power and sexuality. However, Indian jewelry was not just for women. Jeweled armlets, rings that bore the weight of dynasties, and turbans adorned with gems were all worn by kings. Priests sanctified talismans to fend off death or give bravery, and warriors wore them around their necks or wrists when they went into battle. Jade became the stone of immortality in other Eastern countries like China and Southeast Asia. Because it was thought to harmonize the body and maintain the spirit, it was more valuable than gold. Pendants featuring carved dragons, phoenixes, and lotus blossoms were worn from birth until death, and frequently interred with the wearer to help them transition into the afterlife. Jewelry was and is a form of poetry, power, and prayer across the East. It guards without weapons, speaks without words, and adorns not only the body, but also life's path. A culture divided between the opulence of royalty and the solemnity of religion influenced the unique shapes and meanings that jewelry took on in medieval Europe. During this period, rings were used to cement alliances and destiny, crowns were seen as divine symbols, and even the smallest pendant could serve as a prayer. Jewelry changed from pagan amulets to holy emblems of faith as Christianity expanded throughout Europe. In order to show devotion and provide protection, crosses became popular pendants. Encased in elaborate reliquaries, relics, including pieces of holy fabric, pieces of saints' bones, and even drops of what was thought to be Christ's blood, were worn near the heart. These weren't merely pretty things. They were thought to be spiritually charged and able to intercede or heal. Goldsmiths were hired by churches and monasteries to create intricate chalices, rings for bishops, and rosary beads strung with jet or pearls. Each piece had a purpose, whether it was to express authority, show piety, or evoke awe. Jewelry has evolved beyond personal use. It had turned theological and political. Jewelry was a sign of legitimacy and ancestry in royal courts. Sapphires, rubies, and emeralds were set into crowns, scepters, and brooches for symbolic as well as aesthetic purposes. Sapphire represented knowledge and heavenly favor. Ruby for passion and bravery. Emerald for rebirth and fertility. Like language, these gems were employed by kings and queens who used each stone to compose a message. Rings were exchanged by feudal lords to certify their allegiance. Knights received jeweled tokens to wear over their armor as a charm and a symbol of their cause. These tokens could be a lady's brooch or a locket. Additionally, it became fashionable to wear mourning rings which were sealed in gold and engraved with names and dates in remembrance of departed loved ones. Who could wear what was determined by sumptuary restrictions among the emerging merchant class? The line between classes was clearly marked by jewelry. Base metals for commoners, pearls for the rich. Simple ornaments, however, continued to be worn even by peasants. A carved bone charm, a braided rope, and a copper ring. Despite not having the same brilliance as a royal ruby, they were equally significant to the wearer. Jewelry was no longer solely associated with beauty or wealth in the medieval era. It had evolved into a conduit for faith, a symbol of loyalty, and a link between the spiritual and the material worlds. The Renaissance spread across Europe like a revival of light as the continent came out of the shadows of the Middle Ages. Jewelry was taken to a completely new level during this period of individualism, science, art, and rediscovery. It evolved into a declaration of intellectual sophistication, artistic patronage, and personal refinement rather than only being symbolic or devout. Wealthy aristocrats, merchants, nobles, and emerging dynasties started hiring skilled goldsmiths to create personalized jewelry. These craftspeople combined modern inventions with ancient Greek and Roman methods, drawing inspiration from classical antiquity. Enameling took off. Intricate symmetrical patterns were used to arrange colored gemstones. Working alongside painters, writers, and architects, goldsmiths evolved into independent artists. Nobility is seen in portraits from the 15th and 16th centuries wearing elegant chains, jeweled hairnets, and neckpieces set with pearls, sapphires, and rubies. Jewelry wasn't only ornamental, the language was coded. A locket could hold a lock of hair or a portrait of a lover. Allegorical figures may be found on a brooch. The phoenix represents rebirth, the Ouroboros represents eternity, or Cupid represents love. Although it became less institutional and more personal, religious jewelry still had a place. Within intricate designs were little devotional pendants engraved with biblical scenes or saints. Gold and coral beads were used to strung rosaries, which were carried for both prayer and prestige. The gemstone's development as more than just a symbol also occurred during the Renaissance. It became a focal point. As cutting methods advanced, gem dealers traveled far and wide to purchase pearls from the Persian Gulf, emeralds from Colombia, and diamonds from India. In addition to being worn, these stones were admired, discussed, and even presented as diplomatic presents at court. Women wore elaborate, multi-layered jewelry. Collars covered in jewels, earrings with pearls hanging, and girdles adorned with trinkets. Men wore adorning sword hilts, jeweled rings, and office chains. Jewelry evolved into a wearable canvas that combined creativity, aspiration, and individuality. Beauty was considered divine throughout the Renaissance, and jewelry became a means of expressing that divinity in form, stone, and gold when worn near the body, as a bright, unquestionable proclamation of self, not as a whisper of position. Jewelry changed once more as the Renaissance gave way to the Baroque period, becoming a dramatic representation of luxury, riches, and international influence. Adornment increased in drama, extravagance, and political significance between the 17th and the early 18th centuries. Jewelry was no longer solely a question of personal preference. It was a declaration of imperial and personal domination. Adornment was accepted as a performance at European courts, particularly those of Louis XIV in France and the Habsburgs in Spain and Austria. Collars lifted, necklines plunged, and every exposed surface became a decorative opportunity. Men dressed themselves in thick gold chains and emblems adorned with gemstones, while women wore bodices decorated in clusters of gemstones. Fans, gloves, shoe buckles, and hairpins were all covered in priceless stones. It was not simply art that fueled this glitter eruption. Conquest was the term. At this point, European powers were spreading over the world. Royal treasury were overflowing with wealth from Africa, India, and the Americas. The basic materials for European luxury were gold mined by colonized labor, emeralds from Colombia, and diamonds from Golconda. As the glittering prize of imperial ambition, jewelry evolved into a show of colonial might. The renowned La Peregrina pearl is one well-known example. It was found in the 16th century off the coast of Panama and was owned by Spanish aristocrats, Napoleon's brother, and later Hollywood star Elizabeth Taylor. However, centuries of conquest, labor, and cultural exchange were the reasons behind its beauty. Baroque jewelry wasn't understated. Rings became little sculptures, earrings frequently reached the shoulders, and brooches became big and elaborate. The architecture and music of the era were mirrored in the scrolls, ribbons, and floral themes of the era, rich, multi-layered, and emotionally charged. Additionally, religious jewelry became increasingly intricate. Diamonds were used to set rosaries. Portable relics were created, worn as lockets embellished with angels, doves, and gilded thorns, and filled with the bones of saints. Jewelry evolved into both an altar and armor. However, a new global order was emerging behind the glitz. The rise of the merchant class, trade, and colonization started to change who could afford luxury and who could no longer be disregarded. There was more to the Baroque era than mere ostentation. Controlling the story with gold, gemstones, and spectacle was the goal. The story of who governed the world and who suffered as a result was recounted via jewelry. There was a lot of turmoil throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Monarchies were overthrown by revolutions, the middle class rose to prominence, and the Industrial Revolution changed how people dressed, worked, and decorated. Once the sole language of the church and aristocracy, jewelry started to change, becoming more democratic, more intimate, and surprisingly more romantic. Excessive jewelry became less popular after the French Revolution. Excessive shows of affluence may be harmful. Neoclassical, simpler styles were popular. Influenced by classical Greece and Rome, a subliminal reference to the principles of equality, rationality, and controlled elegance. Consider lockets worn near the heart beneath the collar, delicate cameos, and laurel wreath patterns. However, a distinct form of extravagance emerged with the Victorian era, one that is based on sentiment rather than monarchy. A lot of jewelry from the 19th century was influenced by Queen Victoria of England. Her romance with Prince Albert was preserved in lockets of hair, mourning brooches, and matching bracelets. Jewelry became quite sentimental, a continuation of loss, love, and memories. The popularity of engagement rings increased. Charm bracelets and birthstone jewelry did the same. Every piece is a piece of a person's own story. Technological developments made jewelry more widely available. Machine-cut stones, electroplating, and mass manufacture made it possible for the middle class to follow trends that were formerly exclusive to the nobility. Jewelry for costumes appeared, not phony, yet stylish, enabling frequent and affordable self-expression. Global impact, meanwhile, kept growing. During the Art Nouveau movement, Japanese elements made their way into Western design. The flowing, gem-studded fashions of elite ateliers were influenced by Persian and Mughal motifs. Both cultural fusion and exploitation followed colonization, as evidenced by the gemstones and fashions worn from Paris to New York. Jewelry brands like Tiffany, Camaros, and Cartier were becoming well known by the late 19th century. They were more than just shops. These companies would contribute to the definition of luxury in the 21st century. Their designs created classic yet contemporary objects by fusing elegance and individuality, emotional but refined. During this time, jewelry became more than just a prestige symbol. It evolved into a wearable biography, commemorating births, lamenting funerals, signifying partnerships, and even commemorating independence. And a revolution in design and style was just around the corner, one that would permanently alter the jewelry industry. Traditions were broken and boundaries were redrawn throughout the 20th century. In art, in politics, and definitely in jewelry. Jewelry evolved beyond decoration, from the Art Deco movement to street fashion, from the glitzy red carpet to hand-woven tribal beads. It evolved into self-expression, a declaration of identity, resistance, and reinvention in addition to status. Art Deco's powerful geometry was introduced in the early 1900s. This style, which was influenced by Egyptian archaeology, industrial design, and Jazz-age glitz, emphasized contrast, symmetry, and crisp lines. Favorites included diamonds, onyx, and platinum. Women wore flapper-style necklaces and long, linear earrings. Men accessorized themselves with tie bars and cufflinks. It was a modernity celebration, jewelry for a world that is rapidly moving forward. Fashion briefly moved toward restraint during world wars, but glitter was rekindled by post-war affluence. Hollywood influenced jewelry trends in the 1950s. Pearls and diamonds became associated with elegance because to celebrities like Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe. Houses like Cartier, Van Cleef and Arpels, and Harry Winston, on the other hand, combined celebrity and aristocracy to become emblems of worldwide luxury. By the 1960s and 1970s, jewelry started to express disobedience. Handmade, spiritual, and nature-inspired items were popular among the counterculture movement. The free spirit came to be associated with turquoise, leather, and beads. On the other hand, maximalism returned throughout the 1980s disco era. Bold jewels, big earrings, and gold chains reflected a decade of luxury and ambition. Identity jewelry followed. I wear these pieces to express who I am. Political brooches, zodiac pendants, nameplate necklaces, and pride pins. Jewelry evolved to become a representation of gender, culture, belief, and community. It revealed to the world your position, your loved ones, and your survival. The discussion surrounding jewelry has broadened in recent years to encompass sustainability, ethics, and narrative. Lab-grown diamonds put traditional notions of value to the test. Family heritage is given fresh vitality through heirloom redesigns. Indigenous workmanship and community are valued over mass manufacturing in artisan revival movements. Digital culture also has a role to play. Today's jewelry may be handmade by a local artist, be popular on Instagram, or represent a cause that is dear to the wearer's heart. Jewelry is now as varied as the people who wear it, and it is no longer limited to gold or diamonds. Meaning is more important than brilliance alone. Jewelry has always spoken, from the amulets of Mesopotamia to the signet rings of the digital age. Furthermore, people will always want to express who they are. A sight that once equaled the magnificence of Rome itself can be found on the glittering southern Italian coast, not far from the bustle of contemporary Naples. Baia. Today it is mostly forgotten by time, quiet, and partially submerged, but something remarkable lingers beneath its serene waters and worn ruins. Shrouded in mystery and steam, a chamber carved deep into volcanic rock and lost to the sea. Some speculate that it might be a real entrance to the underworld, and they refer to it as the Oracle Tomb. Baia was more than just a metropolis to the ancients. It was a haven of vision and vice, pleasure and prophecy. It lay on the smouldering plains, the restless earth of the Campi Flegrei, a huge volcanic crater where the earth smoulders, breathes and changes. Waters bubble in an unusual way, and gases hiss from earthen fissures. The actual world seems thin there, as though there was something else directly below it. Emperors, generals, and poets used Baia as a playground for centuries. Luxurious villas clung to the cliffs. Private ports were overlooked by statues of heroes and gods. However, a large portion of the city was submerged as the sea rose and the ground sank. Now, beneath the waves, the marble promenades and mosaic floors are silent, unaffected by the air, and only occasionally spotted by divers and fish. Nevertheless, one room stands out among these underwater marvels. It plunges into darkness, partially submerged and concealed close to the remains of an old bath complex. This is no typical ruin. It was purposefully carved, loaded with meaning, and connected to something sacred or prohibited that went beyond architecture. Entering it now would be entering another reality, one in which the stones might still be alive with the air of myth. It was named the Oracle Tomb by contemporary archaeologists. Older voices, however, referred to it as the cavern or the antrim, a location where prophecies might be derived from vapors, where the line separating the living from the dead grew thin, and where those with the courage to venture down may enter not just the earth, but also the very minds of old Rome. Whatever is inside doesn't sleep soundly. The story starts when the land disappears under the sea and the oracle tomb is waiting. Baia was not a typical Roman community. Built for pleasure rather than for government or combat, it served as the empire's escape route and a haven for emperors, nobles, and the privileged elite. Baia, a lavish city shrouded in scandal and drenched in pleasure, was tucked away along the Bay of Naples. To stroll along its marble streets was to be in close proximity to influential people. Its thermal springs were a place to immerse oneself in hedonistic and healing rituals. Built on top of a restless volcano, the city's landscape was just as famous as its wealth. Directly above the Campi Flegrei, a huge supervolcano whose energy boiled its waters, heated the land and gave the air an odd, metallic smell. Baia rose. This area was referred to as the breathing place of the gods by the Romans. The soil itself appeared to be alive here, changing, releasing sulfur, and using steam to communicate secrets. Magnificent bathhouses, domed pavilions, and private mansions that surpassed anything in the city were built here by Roman engineers and artists. Julius Caesar, Hadrian, and Nero all owned villas here. These were hubs of politics, affairs, and decadence, in addition to being places of repose. What transpired at Baia was alleged to have persisted there. The city became so closely associated with excess that it was publicly denounced by moralists and poets. It was dubbed a vortex of luxury by Seneca the Younger. However, Baia's geological splendor proved to be its downfall. The soil beneath it started to change over time as a result of the volcanic activity that heated its spars and created its mystery. Whole areas of the city gradually sank as a result of a phenomenon called bradyseism, which is the rising and falling of the earth induced by volcanic gas movement. Baia's lower levels had been absorbed by the sea by the late Roman era. A strange underwater museum, temples, gardens, and floors covered in mosaics now lay beneath shallow, shimmering seas. Today's divers pass across abandoned sculptures and marble columns. The sea has maintained it like a sleeping ghost of empire, leaving behind what was once the epicenter of sexual pleasure. The chamber, which is claimed to be the entryway to the underworld itself, was carved into myth and remained concealed for generations amidst these smoldering cracks and submerged ruins. For almost 2,000 years, the oracle tomb of Baia was lost, buried in volcanic soil, obscured by myth, and eventually forgotten. That is until the middle of the 20th century, when Robert Paget, a British amateur explorer and civil engineer, made a modest but remarkable discovery. Paget was neither a well-known archaeologist nor a headline-seeking treasure seeker. Together with his co-worker Keith Jones and a small group of volunteers, Paget started excavating a strange location close to the old Baia Baths in the 1960s. They discovered a short, stone-lined corridor that sank down into the hillside, guided by ancient manuscripts, geological surveys, and a feeling that there was more beneath the surface than anyone realized. At first glance, the tunnel appeared to be just another example of Roman engineering, nothing special. However, when they dug further, they noticed odd features, purposefully carved curves, abrupt temperature changes, increasing humidity, and eventually a steeply dropping path with benches carved into the rock on either side. It wasn't an aqueduct, it was ceremonial. It looked more and more like something sacred or forbidden the farther they walked. Their investigation uncovered a meticulously planned descent that ended in a room that was partially submerged in water. Steam rising from the black pool was sulphurous. Visibility was poor and the air was dense, and there was a feeling of unease in the shadows, as though the old stone itself recalled. Paget believed it. They had discovered the fabled antrum, the hallowed cavern that ancient Roman authors had written about, and which was thought to be the home of Apollo's prophetic priestess, the Cumaean Sibyl. This was not the conventional kind of tomb. It served as a gateway, a man-made drop into the underworld where prophecy, initiation, and maybe necromancy had once been practiced. The arrangement was uncannily similar to classical accounts. Aeneas descended into Hades close to Lake Avernus, a few kilometers from Baia, according to Virgil's Aeneid. He claimed that the Sibyl guided him into a stuffy cavern of vapors and darkness. It appeared like Paget and his group had followed the same route. The oracle tomb of Baia remains one of the most eerie archaeological finds of the 20th century, despite the fact that mainstream academia at the time largely disregarded his findings. This is not because it proved anything, but rather because it implied that mythology might occasionally leave a physical trail. Returning to the realm of Roman myth is necessary to fully understand the oracle tomb's enigma, to the tales that pilgrims dreaded, poets murmured, and scribes preserved. The Cumaean Sibyl, a figure associated with the underworld, towers over all else in this landscape of gods and shadows. Legend has it that the Sibyl was an Apollo priestess who resided close to Lake Avernus, a lake formed by volcanic craters not far from Baia. This lake was considered by the Romans to be the real gateway to Hades, the afterlife. Birds were reported to have died while flying over the Earth's cursed surface, and fumes rose gradually from its banks. For a seer claiming to speak for the gods and the ghosts beyond, it was the ideal environment. The predictions of the Sibyl were mysterious and frequently dreadful. It was believed that she would go into trance-like states when drunk on volcanic fumes, her voice resonating through a cave that went down into the soil, a sacred tunnel. Scholars conjectured about the location of this fabled oracle for centuries. The response provided by Paget's discovery in Baia was convincing. The structure he discovered is similar to what is described in traditional sources. In the Aeneid, Virgil wrote of a gloomy scene where the Sibyl brought the hero Aeneas to speak with the dead. The scene was hot with the earth's breath. He described stifling vapors, a frightening hush that hung above the underworld's entrance, and silence that was only broken by the pouring of invisible water. Baia's oracle tomb echoes this picture in both construction and feeling. People who have passed through the tight hole describe the intense heat, the sulphurous chemical smell, and the confusing darkness. The water-filled cavern at the end of the tunnel reflects all light like obsidian glass. The room has a tomb-like quietness due to the suppressed sound. Was this the chamber in which the Sibyl actually spoke? Or was it a later attempt by the Romans to reproduce a mythical location? In any case, it has a chilling effect. It makes the metaphysical tangible. It creates space for the holy, gives shape to fear, and creates a physical descent into the unconscious, death and prophecy that is similar to the spiritual one. The oracle tomb is more than just the underworld's entryway. That's how it feels. Baia's oracle tomb is not a random construction. The experience is a calculated one. It appears that every arc, drop, and room inside its volcanic walls is intended to guide the soul, as well as the body, through metamorphosis. In the past, passing through it was more than just a curious thing to do. It was customary. Initiation was the term, controlled by the elemental elements of the Roman underworld, fire, steam, and water. It was a plunge into mystery. During their exploration of the site in the 1960s, Robert Paget and his colleagues came to view the tunnel as a spiritual theatre, as well as an architectural wonder. After a gentle beginning, the route narrowed and twisted before descending into darkness and heat that grew thicker. Benches with carvings indicated that pilgrims would have stopped to pray or meditate. The scenery altered more as one went deeper. The heat from the volcano grew stronger. The condensation slickened the walls. Sulfur, the very breath of the chthonic universe, began to weigh heavily on the air. A final plunge marked the end of the adventure. A compartment partially immersed in thermal water was reached via a secret staircase. The actual chamber, a pool that reflected light like ink, was contained, silent, and bizarre. In the past, the steam rising from the surface would have been illuminated by torchlight dancing over the ceiling. The experience would have been unearthly, as if one were standing between worlds, engrossed in both the material and the spiritual. According to Paget's theory, this lake might have symbolized the Styx, the river that in Greek and Roman mythology divided the living from the dead. That descent from light to shade, from life to the brink of death, would be mirrored in the ritual trip through the tunnel. It's possible that those who went in did so in order to get prophecy, forgiveness, or to commune with their ancestors' spirits before leaving. Retracing their steps slowly, they rose toward daylight once more. However, they wouldn't come out unaltered. Like smoke, the experience would linger. They had stepped on the brink of something unknown and immense. They had entered a world few ventured to explore, whether or not they heard the Sibyl's voice. This was not travel, it was a pilgrimage. Additionally, individuals who traversed the oracle tomb were altered by the same elements that created it: fire, earth, and water. Despite its modest size, the oracle tomb of Bayer is a profound architectural masterpiece. Layer by layer, what at first looks like a straightforward volcanic passage turns out to be a marvel of symbolic building, created for the experience of death and return rather than the living world. Although the passage is around 400 feet long, its psychological depth is much greater than its actual length. It wasn't until Robert Paget and his group realized that the tunnel was constructed with a specific purpose. It wasn't purely utilitarian or random. Rather of being a public bath or burial, the orientation, angles, and rooms suggested an initiation process. It resembled myth in form. Light comes in innocently at the beginning of the opening. However, the path abruptly and purposefully curves, cutting off the view of the outside world. The channel narrows and the air gets warmer. Light dims. Every action turns becomes an act of faith in the framework and the energies it was intended to evoke. A vertical shaft, perhaps intended to transport hot gases upward from subterranean vents, intersects the tunnel about halfway through the descent. This, Paget thought, was no coincidence. It's possible that sulfuric fumes from the shaft enhanced the tunnel's appearance of descending into an other world. Intoxicating, disorienting, and sacred, these fumes were considered by the ancient mind to be the very breath of the gods. The tunnel then twists once more before dropping into the last room, known as the Oracle Pool, via a slender stairway. The only way to access this partially submerged, darkened space was to step into the water itself. According to some academics, the echo of stone and the distortion of steam may have helped a hidden priestess or attendant deliver predictions in a trance-like voice from an invisible alcove. According to this perspective, the architecture was a form of spiritual technology. It provided the illusion, or maybe the reality, of heavenly communion, manipulated the senses, and governed the voyage. This area was constructed for world transition, much like the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Impressing was not the goal. It was supposed to change. The oracle tomb was a stone carving of the ceremony, not only a place to store it. The oracle tomb of Bay is situated at an odd intersection of metaphor and archaeology, of physical ruin and timeless myth. It makes us wonder where folklore starts and history ends. Long connected to the neighboring Cumae cave systems, the Cumaean Sibyl is more than just a mythological character. Roman historians documented her, generals dreaded her, and she was glorified in literature. Legend has it that Apollo gave her 1,000 years to live, but she neglected to request eternal youth. Gradually, she faded, her voice resonating from the Earth's interior, a prophetic murmur from the emptiness. This area is dominated by her presence. She is at the heart of the Aeneid's journey into the underworld, according to Roman poet Virgil. In one story, the protagonist Aeneas goes up to the Sibyl, who leads him through a pitch-black tunnel teeming with toxic fumes and sacred fear into Hades. The scene? Only a few miles from the location of Baia's Oracle Tunnel, close to Lake Avernus. This literary plunge appears to be too closely mirrored by Paget's discovery, the gloomy descent, the sulphur smells, and the last chamber of water to be disregarded. Were the mythology inspired by this chamber, or was the chamber constructed as a tribute to the myths since they were so widely accepted? Historians continue to disagree. For some, the tunnel is a form of immersive religious theatre for elite initiates, a complex Roman ritual venue that may have been constructed to mimic the fabled journey. Others speculate that it might have served a more literal function, enabling genuine oracular experiences brought on by hallucinogenic gases and the potent psychological impacts of the surroundings. Alternatively, it might have been both. Myth and reality were not distinct realms to the ancient Romans. A temple housed a god, not just a representation of one. A cave was the threshold, not merely a representation of the underworld. It is unlikely that the individuals who entered this tunnel thousands of years ago interpreted it as a metaphor. They saw that as admission. The oracle tomb thus transcends its status as a ruin. It is a place that retains the psychological landscape of a society that had a strong belief in what lay beneath, a memory that will not go away. Robert Paget and Keith Jones did not receive the praise one might anticipate for discovering a potential underworld door when they revealed their results in the 1960s. In actuality, a large portion of the academic community viewed their statements with suspicion, if not outright rejection. Why? Due to the fact that the oracle tomb did not cleanly fall into any of the established categories. It was neither an inscription-adorned temple nor an artifact-filled tomb. Neither the record of Rome's civic structures nor the magnificence of Pompeii were present. Many people thought it was merely a strange tunnel carved out of the side of a hill, not a revelation, but a curiosity. The accuracy of the structure, however, disproved that designation. Its subterranean water chamber, temperature changes, design, and correspondence with old literary accounts all suggested that it was more than a coincidence. Although Paget's interpretation was daring, it wasn't without precedent, and his documentation was comprehensive. After all, from Delphi to Eleusis, the ancient world is replete with prophetic passages and hallowed caverns. A new generation of scholars has recently returned to Baia, bringing with them cutting-edge technology and new perspectives. The city's hidden treasures, including as garden courtyards, submerged mosaics, and thermal bath systems, are starting to come to light thanks to ground-penetrating radar, underwater archaeology, and 3D mapping. Once derided, the Oracle Tomb is now being re-examined as a useful area in a myth-based society rather than as fantasy. The engineering is intentional, even critics have to concede. Everything from mist and acoustics to heat and darkness is intentionally altered. This is more significant than whether it was constructed for a real fall to Hades or to mimic one. It was successful. The trip would have altered the visitors' feeling. Their senses were shaped, their direction was disturbed, and their mental state was changed by the tunnel. Through gas-induced trance, myth, or ritual, it carried them to the brink of something they couldn't identify, and then back again. The oracle tomb is a reflection of all major spiritual experiences in this way. It provides no answers, it raises a query, one that is inscribed in stone and quiet. Does this myth become true, or does myth shape reality? For thousands of years, Baya's oracle chamber has been silent. However, even in its quiet, it still pushes us to think more deeply, listen in a different way, and consider whether the ancient world knew something that we have since forgotten. Today, the more well-known ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum have eclipsed the oracle tomb of Baya, which is often ignored by tourists. Its modest entrance is devoid of triumphal arches or statues. Like a secret, the tunnel vanishes into the hillside, waiting, moist and silent. Nevertheless, many who enter continue to report the same feeling, a faint tightness of the air, a silence that shrouds the senses. Its stone has worn with time, yet its mystery has not. This site's structure and environment aren't the only things that make it so captivating and uncanny. It's the impression it gives us that we are not only studying the past, but are instead encountering something more ancient, a portal to the innermost thoughts of the ancient world. Even with their legions and highways, the Romans were still afraid of what was beneath them. At the edge of volcanic craters, they offered sacrifices to the deceased and erected shrines over cave openings. Every August, they thought the ghosts of the dead roamed freely among the living, and they called the entrance to the underworld Mundus. With its sulphur-scented air and bubbling springs, Baya personified this transitional area, not paradise nor hell, but the borderline. One of the few remaining locations where that notion feels real is the oracle tomb. Joining the lineage of seekers, pilgrims, emperors, and possibly even the insane who came here in search of truth, or at least a glimpse of it, instead of treasure, is what it means to descend its corridor. In that chamber, what did they hear? What questions did they pose to the Sibyl? How much did prophecy cost them? Maybe the point is that we'll never know. Baya reminds us that some experiences were never intended to be fully understood, which is a holy reminder in an era that is fixated on proof. Some buildings were constructed to cradle questions in a safe, silent, stone environment rather than to contain answers. The oracle tomb, which reflects our enduring preoccupation with the afterlife, continues to exist as a combination of myth, monument, and reflection. It is a whisper etched into the ground, a ceremony that endures in the dark, a gate that never completely shuts, and it still waits for those who dare to enter. Simone Biles had to live, whether she flipped, twisted, or soared. Simone Ariane Biles was born in Columbus, Ohio, on March 14, 1997, into an unstable society. Simone and her brothers were placed in foster care on and off, while her biological mother battled addiction. There were times of doubt, turmoil, and separation. Such an environment might be overwhelming for the majority of children. However, Simone's flame started to flicker even in these early, vulnerable years. She was just 3 years old when the spark found its fuel. Their maternal grandfather, Ron Biles, and his entrepreneur and nursing wife, Nellie, took in Simone and her siblings. In the end, Simone and her sister Adria were formally adopted by Ron and Nellie, who provided them with safety, stability, and unwavering love in addition to legal guardianship. They were never stand-ins to Simone. They were and still are parents. Simone's new life started to take root at their house in Houston, Texas. During a school trip to a nearby gym for daycare, young Simone once noticed something that made her feel very happy. Athletes flipping through the air as if it was second nature, spring floors and tumbling mats. She had trouble staying still. On the sidelines, she imitated the techniques until a coach gave her a note recommending that she take classes. Everything changed with that note It was almost immediately clear that Simone had a natural talent. She possessed what coaches subsequently referred to as air awareness, explosive power, and an extraordinary sense of balance. The uncommon capacity to constantly be aware of her body's location while in flight. Above all, though, she possessed a strong work ethic and a genuine thrill when she moved. Gymnastics was more than just a sport. She came to life there. She began taking her training seriously by the time she was 6. Coaches were speculating about her potential by the age of 8. She was still a young child, petite, quiet, and smiling shyly, but she had no fear on the mat. Her future was uncertain, and her past was turbulent. But she found purpose, control, and focus in gymnastics. Simone Biles did not come from a wealthy family. Adversity was a part of her birth. She didn't simply overcome it, though. She turned her suffering into gasoline and flipped it around. She was fighting gravity long before she became a champion. The rise of Simone Biles wasn't a coincidence. Sharpened by years of sacrifice and discipline, it was the ideal fusion of ability, opportunity, and perseverance. After being intrigued by that childcare field trip, Simone started going to Bannon's Gymnastics in Houston for real instruction. Her coaches quickly recognized that they were witnessing something unique, not only unadulterated talent, but an inexplicable combination of fearlessness, explosive strength, and, rarer still, joy in the face of difficulty. Simone was executing skills years ahead of her peers by the time she was 8 years old. She had a physical edge because she was short, finally only 4'8". Her coaches pushed her, but she was able to perform twists with an almost magical sense of air awareness, rotate more quickly, and spring higher. One of the most important people in Simone's early life was Coach Amy Borman, who started training her when she was a small girl and continued to mentor her throughout her ascent to fame. The routines became more difficult, but Simone, with her quiet tenacity, just kept pushing back. Their cooperation was based on mutual respect, trust, and patience. Borman taught Simone not only gymnastics, but also how to be a competitor, channel energy, silence doubt, and turn nerves into power. Although she was homeschooled to allow for more flexible training hours, Simone's life was not solely focused on gymnastics, and her training was tailored to her well-being, unlike many elite gymnasts who train through rigorous, even rigid, systems. Her childhood was protected by her parents and Borman, even as she entered a sport that often erases it. She was rooted in faith, family, and humor, and by the age of 14, Simone was already making waves in junior elite events. She enjoyed pizza, hanging out with her brothers, and doing backflips in the backyard for fun. Simone's greatest power wasn't just physical, it was mental. Her routines were full of risk and difficulty, moves that most girls wouldn't even try, much less perfect. She didn't just finish skills, she exploded through them, making even the hardest combinations look effortless. Her foundation wasn't fame, rather it was forged in sweat, family, and the kind of belief that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Simone wasn't just learning gymnastics, she was creating the tools that would redefine the sport. She exuded a quiet confidence, a strong internal compass, and a refusal to be anything other than herself. When Simone Biles entered the senior elite level at the age of 16 and traveled to Antwerp, Belgium, for the World Artistic Gymnastics Championships in 2013, she was no longer merely a rising star, but a force rushing toward the international scene, unstoppable and uncompromising. What transpired there would alter both her life and the history of gymnastics. Not only did Simone win, but she also astonished the world by winning 2 gold medals, including the coveted all-around championship, and making a name for herself as the world's finest gymnast right away, with her technically flawless, daring routines that featured abilities no one else had tried. Over the next few years, Simone would go on to dominate the sport in a way no woman had ever done before. Her tumbling passes defied physics, her landings were solid, and her movements were crisp, powerful, and uniquely hers. Suddenly people realized that this was not just a new champion, but a gymnast operating in an entirely new dimension, and she was just getting started. She won 3 straight all-around world championship titles from 2013 to 2016, which had never been done by an American woman before. She was incredibly consistent, improving her routines year after year and scoring far higher than her colleagues. She made the impossible look regular, yet Simone competed with delight, and it was her presence, not just her difficulty, that made her stand out. She flowed between skills with a kind of brilliance that lighted up the arena, and audiences weren't simply seeing a gymnast, they were witnessing a transformation. While others displayed nervousness, she grinned. In addition to winning events, Simone Biles was changing the definition of women's gymnastics, and her ascension coincided with a period of change in the sport, according to commentators, judges, and even past Olympians. By the time the world started getting ready for the 2016 Olympics, one thing was clear. Simone embodied the power, personality, and authenticity that were replacing the old standards of rigid beauty and passive performance. She didn't try to fit in. Instead, she made the sport bend around her. Not only was Simone Biles the favorite, but she was the future. By the summer of 2016, she had transformed from a gymnastics wonder to a potential worldwide icon, and everyone's eyes were on Rio de Janeiro, where the Olympic Games were expected to be her coronation. Simone went into the competition with extremely high expectations and yet soared even higher. Years of preparation, pressure, and anticipation had led to this moment, and she delivered not just gold, but a performance that would redefine greatness in the sport. Simone won 4 gold medals and 1 bronze during the Games, which is the most medals an American gymnast has won at an Olympics in more than 30 years. She was the best in the all-around vault floor exercise and helped the US team win gold in the team final, which was dubbed the Final 5. However, it wasn't just about her winnings, it was also about how she won. Her signature move on the floor, the Biles, a double layout with a half twist, became an instant classic, and on vault she launched herself into the air with such force that it seemed as if gravity stopped to admire her. Her routines included moves so challenging that the scoring system had to change to accommodate them. Audiences yelled, commentators looked for parallels, and her elegance met brutal force in a way gymnastics had never seen before. However, Simone Biles was unique. She was setting a new benchmark, and even other gymnasts looked on in admiration, not jealously, but with respect. They knew they were seeing something unique, a full-fledged gymnast in complete mastery of her art. But off the mat, Simone stayed grounded, laughing during press conferences, sharing silly pictures with teammates, and giving credit to her parents, coaches, and faith. Her triumph in Rio was not only historic, but also revolutionary, changing the public's idea of what female athletes could be: strong, joyful, and shamelessly dominant. She was more than simply a competitor, she was a role model. She broke barriers not only in skill but also in visibility and representation, becoming the first woman of color to win Olympic all-around gold for the United States. Simone Biles not only won the Olympics in Rio, but she also owned them with greatness, grace, and grit. After Rio, she returned home not just as a champion, but as a worldwide sensation. She was no longer just well known in the gymnastics community. She was now a household name, a symbol of excellence, and a cultural icon. However, fame came with its own set of problems, including the pressure to perform flawlessly, the weight of fame, and the silent but increasing pressure to continue when the body and mind needed a break. Simone's life changed quickly in the months after the Olympics, including a national tour with her colleagues, several TV appearances, and even a Dancing with the Stars competition. She also wrote a biography, Courage to Soar, which became a bestseller. Magazine covers, interviews, red carpet events, and endorsements poured in. Simone had achieved stardom outside of her sport, but beneath the spotlight, a new reality was emerging. When Simone was off the competition floor for the first time in years, she paused to think about who she was outside of gymnastics and what she wanted now that she had accomplished everything the sport had to offer. The pressure didn't go away. It changed. Every action she took was now closely examined, and every retort was questioned. There was an implicit expectation that Simone Biles would win every competition, but Simone is not a complacent person. She returned to training and competition with newfound vigor by 2018, and this time she was a woman regaining her voice rather than a girl following a dream. She competed at the 2018 US National Championships despite having a kidney stone and 2 fractured toes. Simone not only competed, but she won with scores that blew away the competition. Her performance wasn't just dominant, it was defiant. Most athletes wouldn't have ever stepped onto the mat. Although the world witnessed the medals, the smiles, and the gravity-defying flips, few were aware of the emotional toll that being the best took. The dark underbelly of the sport was starting to show its trauma, and Simone, more than anyone else, was carrying the weight of the sport's traumatic past and its future. The post-Rio era was about more than just maintaining excellence. It was about surviving it. Simone Biles started to find a new type of strength, one that was based on vulnerability rather than performance, in that area between victory and reality. Despite her physical prowess, Simone Biles' most brave moment occurred in front of the world, using a microphone to speak the truth about trauma rather than medals. It didn't happen on a balance beam or under the Olympic rings. It was difficult for Simone Biles, who was by then the sport's face, to come forward when she disclosed in 2018 that she was among the hundreds of gymnasts who had been mistreated by former USA gymnastics physician Larry Nassar, a man who had exploited athletes for decades under the pretense of medical treatment. Despite being severely damaged, the organization's brightest star refused to remain silent, writing in an online statement, "I am no longer afraid to tell my story." She wasn't merely defending herself, it was a proclamation, not simply a confession. In doing so, Simone changed from champion to changemaker, demanding accountability not only from Nassar, but also from USA Gymnastics and the US Olympic Committee, which had allowed his abuse through negligence and cover-ups, on behalf of all the girls who had been harmed, silenced, and ignored. Her bravery was felt well beyond the gym, inspiring fellow athletes to support her as survivors from all over the world recognized their own suffering in her words. The image of Simone speaking before Congress in 2021, distraught but composed, became a memorable moment in American sports history as lawmakers started looking into the matter. However, Simone continued to train despite her fight for justice. As she carried the burden of a dysfunctional system, she continued to dominate competitions, and her performance shifted from being about gold to being about truth, resistance, and healing. Simone redefined strength as honesty rather than stoicism, demonstrating that the best athletes aren't those who never struggle, but rather those who persevere. By breaking the quiet with her voice, Simone accomplished something that even her most challenging vaults were unable to do. She demonstrated that it is possible to be both human and hero. She was no longer only flipping through the air. Instead, she was altering the ground beneath us, and in that hush, a new notion of power surfaced, one that didn't require applause to be significant. Simone Biles was the undisputed face of the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, which had been postponed by a year due to the global pandemic. While everyone was expecting dominance, another gold sweep, and more physics-defying feats, Simone gave us something far more significant, a lesson in courage that had nothing to do with medals. After a weak vault during the team competition, Simone withdrew. The world was initially shocked by the statement, but then they were given an explanation. She was suffering from the twisties, a mental block that causes the body and brain to lose synchronization in midair and is dreaded by gymnasts. It's difficult for the normal person to understand, but for a gymnast doing flips and twists 10 feet above the earth, it's life or death. All of a sudden, the world's strongest athlete had stated the unimaginable. I must take a step back. She did, and her choice rocked the Olympic arena. Pundits argued, critics questioned her toughness, and athletes from many sports came together to praise her. Simone did not vanish after withdrawing. They were aware of the price. They realized that saying, "not today," requires guts. She became a shining example of what it meant to be human under pressure, as well as what it means to compete by showing up in the arena every day to encourage and cheer on her teammates while also laughing and crying. She returned a few days later for her last competition, the balance beam final, and won a bronze medal with a reduced routine, but the true victory wasn't on the podium. Rather, it was her decision to safeguard her mental well-being in front of the world. Simone changed the definition of strength by presenting a model of wisdom, self-awareness, and radical vulnerability in a society that is fixated on enduring pain. She reminded us that even the most accomplished athletes are human beings with needs, limitations, and trauma, and that acknowledging those boundaries is the purest expression of strength, not weakness. Simone didn't take home 4 gold medals in Tokyo, but she contributed something much more enduring. After Tokyo, many questioned whether Simone Biles would ever compete again, but she had already transcended the sport, not only as the most decorated gymnast in history, but also as a symbol of honesty and tenacity. She allowed people to take a break, to defend themselves, and to put their health before expectations. Simone took a break from the competitive world for more than a year, but she wasn't done, not with gymnastics and not with her own story. She sought therapy and concentrated on her physical, mental, and emotional well-being. She spoke at mental health events, encouraged athletes from many sports to reconsider the true meaning of success, and made a modest but impactful comeback in 2023. At the US Classic in August 2023, Simone's return to the arena felt more like a homecoming than a comeback, because she wasn't pursuing medals or attempting to prove anything. She was dominating despite doing it on her own terms. Simone not only won that meet, but also shocked everyone with her athletic development at the 2023 US Gymnastics Championships. Once again, a talent was named after her, and she performed new routines, including the Yurchenko double pike fault, a move so risky and challenging that few men try it. This version of Simone was different, with more laughter, more silence, and more choice, but she had once again pushed the limits of what the human body could accomplish. Off the mat, her life flourished as well. She was no longer only the greatest of all time, but a woman in charge of her story, choosing when, how, and why to perform. Speaking candidly about love, happiness, and the difficulties of juggling elite sport with everyday life, she married NFL safety Jonathan Owens in 2023 in a private ceremony that was later celebrated with a lavish destination wedding. Her union became another symbol, not of perfection, but of grounding, of being seen and supported outside of the spotlight. Simone's comeback was about recovering herself, not titles, and in doing so she redefined what longevity means in a sport that is known for exhausting young athletes. By every conceivable measure, Simone Biles is the most decorated gymnast in history. She returned not as a girl with much to prove, but as a woman who had already proven everything and still made the decision to rise. Yet Simone Biles' true legacy goes far beyond the medals, the routines, or even the accolades. With over 30 world and Olympic medals, including 4 skills named after her, she has redefined the boundaries of gymnastics, not just by winning, but by redefining what greatness means. She changed the standard, making it impossible to deny that strength, difficulty, and confidence are equally as attractive as grace. Prior to her, power was appreciated, but artistry was preferred. Not only did she raise the bar, but she also threw it into the air, spun around it twice, and landed smiling, asking, "What's next?" She has become a model for athletes in every discipline, not just gymnastics. Young gymnasts now grow up not only admiring Simone's skill, but also imitating her strength of character because of her advocacy for mental health, athlete safety, and self-worth. She demonstrated that stepping away is not failure, that keeping your peace is a radical act of self-respect, and that even in silence you can speak volumes. In a world that demands constant performance, she offered something braver, authenticity, and she's still going. Whether she chooses to continue competing through another Olympic cycle or takes a different route, her impact on gymnastics and society will endure forever. She has demonstrated to them that it's acceptable to say no, to ask for help, and to define success for yourself. Not only is Simone Biles the greatest gymnast the world has ever seen, but she is also a cultural shift wrapped in muscle and movement, a tale of tenacity, honesty, and quiet revolution. Her leotards are on display in museums, books are being written about her, and kids all over the world are learning to cartwheel because they watched her do it. Simone's story isn't yet complete, but even now, mid-vault, mid-flight, her legacy is already landing exactly where it belongs, in the hearts of those she's lifted, simply by being herself. Her life demonstrates that strength isn't measured by how much you carry, but by knowing when to set it down, that excellence means nothing without integrity, and that the most powerful flips are the ones that bring you back to yourself.